On May 10, 1973, on the set of Enter the Dragon in Hong Kong, Bruce Lee collapsed. He was in the middle of dubbing a scene. One moment he was standing. The next he was on the floor, convulsing, unresponsive, his body doing something his will had never permitted it to do. He was rushed to Hong Kong Baptist Hospital. The diagnosis: cerebral edema. The brain, inexplicably, had swollen inside its own skull. Doctors worked for hours to bring it down. They succeeded. Bruce Lee regained consciousness. He was discharged. He told people he was fine. 2 months later, he was dead. That first episode, the collapse in May, is the key to everything. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was ignored. Because the man who had built his entire identity around the absolute mastery of his own body looked at the most serious warning his body had ever sent him, and decided it didn't apply. This is not a story about a mysterious death. It's a story about what happens when the image of a man and the reality of his body finally, irreversibly, come apart. To understand what killed Bruce Lee, you first have to understand what Bruce Lee believed about himself. Not the legend. Not the mythology. The actual belief system of a man who trained 6 to 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, who kept obsessive journals about his physical output, who wrote philosophical treatises on the nature of combat and the relationship between mind and body, and who genuinely, completely, believed that he had achieved a level of physical mastery that placed him outside the ordinary rules of human limitation. This was not arrogance in the conventional sense. It was a philosophy. He had developed it over 20 years, beginning in the back rooms of Hong Kong, where his teacher Yip Man first showed him that the body, properly trained, could move faster than thought. He had refined it through hundreds of private experiments, testing reaction times, measuring the force of his own strikes, filming himself in slow motion to identify inefficiencies invisible to the naked eye. He had codified it into Jeet Kune Do, a system he explicitly described not as a style but as a process of removing everything that was unnecessary until only truth remained. Bruce Lee didn't think he was invincible. That's too simple. He thought he had solved the problem. He thought that if you understood the body deeply enough, if you trained it with enough precision, fueled it with enough discipline, pushed it with enough intelligence, you could achieve a kind of immunity. Not from everything, but from the ordinary ways that ordinary people broke down. That belief was his greatest gift. It produced something genuinely extraordinary. It was also, in the end, what killed him. He arrived in America in 1959 with almost nothing. 18 years old, $120, a boat ticket, and a reputation in Hong Kong that was more liability than asset. He had been in too many fights, made too many enemies, embarrassed too many people. His mother sent him across the Pacific not as a reward but as a rescue operation. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the chaos she was trying to contain was also the engine. Bruce Lee didn't soften in America. He accelerated. He worked as a waiter in Seattle, taught martial arts in parking lots and back alleys, enrolled at the University of Washington, and spent as much time in the philosophy section of the library as he did in any gym. He read Nietzsche, Krishnamurti, Lao Tzu, Descartes. Not casually. With the same obsessive attention he brought to studying fight footage. He was building something, a framework for understanding physical reality that was simultaneously a fighting system, an aesthetic philosophy, and a theory of the self. What he was building would eventually be called Jeet Kune Do. But in those early Seattle years, it had no name. It was just a young man taking everything apart to see what was actually true. In 1964, at the Long Beach International Karate Championships, the world got its first real glimpse. He walked onto the demonstration floor and performed the 1-inch punch, a strike that travels less than 3 centimeters and sends a grown man stumbling backward into a chair. The crowd went silent for a moment before it erupted. Not because the trick was impressive. Because what they had just seen wasn't a trick. It was a demonstration of something that shouldn't have been physically possible, and yet demonstrably was. Bruce Lee had just introduced himself to America. America didn't know what to do with him yet. But it was paying attention. There is a fight from that same period that matters more to understanding Bruce Lee than almost anything that came after. In late 1964, the Chinese martial arts community in San Francisco issued an ultimatum. Stop teaching non-Chinese students, or face a formal challenge. Bruce refused. They sent a representative, a young master named Wong Jack Man, trained in multiple traditional styles, respected within his community. The fight happened in Bruce's Oakland studio. No cameras. No press. A small group of witnesses. What occurred in that room is still disputed. Linda Lee, Bruce's wife, said it was over in 3 minutes. Bruce overwhelmed Wong with a ferocity he wasn't prepared for. Other witnesses described something longer, more chaotic, less conclusive. Wong Jackman himself said Bruce fought wildly, without control, and exhausted himself. He said he could have hurt Bruce badly but chose not to. 3 accounts. No consensus. But here is what we know for certain. Something about that fight disturbed Bruce Lee deeply enough to change him. He came out of it believing that his technique had failed him. Not that he had lost. He never conceded that. But that when it mattered, when the stress was real and the opponent was resisting and there were no rules and no performance, he had not moved the way he knew he could move. He had reverted. He had relied on aggression where he should have relied on precision. He spent the next several years dismantling everything he thought he knew and rebuilding it from the ground up. He studied boxing, not to supplement his existing system, but to understand footwork and combination theory at the deepest level. He studied wrestling, fencing, judo, savate. He corresponded with coaches and athletes across disciplines. He installed a library in his home specifically for sports science and physiology. And he trained, with an intensity that began, in those years, to cross a line that is difficult to precisely locate. By the early 1970s, Bruce Lee was doing things to his body that no sports scientist of the era would have endorsed. He ran every morning. He cycled. He skipped rope. He hit the bags. He sparred. He practiced forms. He did sit-ups in sets that most professional athletes would have considered excessive, using a specially designed board that allowed him to perform thousands of repetitions at angles his abs were never designed to sustain. He supplemented aggressively, protein shakes, ginseng, royal jelly, vitamin megadoses that were at the extreme edge of what was understood at the time. He experimented with electrical muscle stimulation machines, attaching electrodes to his body to force contractions during rest periods, trying to find additional hours in the day when his muscles could be made to work. He drank enormous quantities of water and juice throughout the day. In Hong Kong's climate, subtropical, humid, temperatures regularly above 35 degrees Celsius, he was working at extreme intensity for hours at a stretch, and he was consuming fluids at a rate that, as we will see, his body was increasingly unable to process correctly. He also, in 1972, made a decision that would later appear in a different and much darker light. He had his axillary sweat glands surgically removed. Both sides. The stated reason was cosmetic. He was filming action sequences, and sweat stains on his costumes were a production problem. The surgery was considered minor. Routine, even. What it meant, physiologically, was that Bruce Lee had permanently eliminated one of his body's primary mechanisms for cooling itself. The human body regulates temperature through sweat. When you exercise intensely in heat, you sweat, sometimes liters per hour, and that evaporation is what keeps your core temperature from rising to dangerous levels. Bruce Lee, after 1972, could not sweat normally from 2 of the largest sweat-producing areas of his body. He was training harder than almost any human being alive, in one of the most punishing climates on Earth, with a compromised cooling system, and compensating by drinking more water than his kidneys could efficiently process. The trap was closing. He didn't know it yet. May 10, 1973. The collapse on the dubbing stage was not subtle. This was not fatigue or heat exhaustion. Bruce Lee's brain swelled. The pressure inside his skull increased to the point where his body shut down. If he had been anywhere other than a city with modern medical facilities, he would have died that morning. He recovered. The doctors discharged him with warnings he did not take seriously enough. Or perhaps he took them seriously for a while. There are accounts of him reducing his training load in the weeks immediately following, but the fundamental behavior didn't change. The water consumption didn't change. The training intensity didn't change. In retrospect, what May 10th was is obvious, a preview. A demonstration of exactly how his body would fail, under exactly the conditions he continued to create. He had 63 days left. July 20th, 1973. Bruce Lee arrived at the Hong Kong apartment of Betty Ting Pei in the early afternoon. She was a Taiwanese actress he had worked with, connected through the production circles that surrounded his films. The producer Raymond Chow was there. They were discussing the script for Game of Death, the film Bruce was developing, a project that was, in many ways, the most personal and philosophically ambitious thing he had ever attempted. At some point in the late afternoon, Bruce said he had a headache. Betty gave him a tablet of Equagesic, a prescription combination of aspirin and a mild muscle relaxant called meprobamate. It was a common medication. She had taken it herself without incident. It was not an exotic compound or a dangerous substance. Bruce said he was going to lie down. Raymond Chow left to arrange a dinner they had all planned. He expected Bruce to join him later. When Betty checked on Bruce hours later, she could not wake him. The ambulance arrived. By the time Bruce Lee reached Queen Elizabeth Hospital, he was already beyond reach. He was pronounced dead at 11:30 p.m. He was 32 years old. The official cause of death, cerebral edema, with a hypersensitivity reaction to the Equagesic listed as the probable trigger, satisfied almost no one. It was too small, too ordinary. The meprobamate, a relatively mild sedative, didn't seem capable of doing what it was accused of doing. And the location, not at home, not with his wife, but in another woman's apartment, ensured that the medical explanation would be buried under speculation for decades. The tabloids did what tabloids do. Betty Ting Pei became a villain in a story that hadn't asked for one. Linda Lee became the wronged wife in a narrative that collapsed the complexity of a marriage into a headline. And the actual question, what had really happened inside Bruce Lee's body, and why, went largely unanswered. The answer came from an unexpected direction, almost 50 years later. In 2022, a team of nephrologists at hospitals in Madrid and A Coruña published a paper in the Clinical Kidney Journal. Their argument was careful, specific, and, once you understood the mechanism, almost unbearably clear. Bruce Lee died of hyponatremia. Hyponatremia is a condition in which the concentration of sodium in the blood falls below safe levels. It happens when you consume more water than your kidneys can excrete, when you flood your system with fluid faster than the body can balance it. The consequence, at its most severe, is that the cells begin to absorb the excess water. They swell, including the cells of the brain. Cerebral edema. The same diagnosis that had appeared in May. The same mechanism. The same outcome. The Spanish researchers pointed to everything that had been documented about Bruce's habits, the liters of water and juice consumed daily, the protein shakes, the extreme training in subtropical heat, and mapped it against what was known about his kidney function. There were indications, they argued, that his kidneys may have already been under stress. The meprobamate in the Equagesic, a mild sedative, is known to increase the secretion of antidiuretic hormone, the hormone that tells the kidneys to retain water. In a person whose sodium levels were already marginal, that additional signal to retain fluid could have been the final variable. It wasn't an allergy. It wasn't poison. It wasn't murder. It was a medication that, in a different body under different conditions, would have done nothing. In Bruce Lee's body, overhydrated, overtrained, cooling impaired, already primed by an episode 2 months earlier, it was the last piece of a trap that had been assembling itself for years. The paper was peer-reviewed. The logic was solid. And it was, to anyone paying attention, devastating in its simplicity. The most physically disciplined human being of his generation had been undone not by an enemy or a toxin or a freak accident. He had been undone by water. By the same obsessive commitment to his own methods that had made him extraordinary. By a belief in what his body could handle that had, in the end, exceeded what his body could actually do. There is something specific about how Bruce Lee approached physical limits that is worth understanding precisely. He was not reckless. That is the important distinction. Recklessness is the absence of thought. What Bruce practiced was something more dangerous, an extremely sophisticated, carefully reasoned commitment to pushing past limits that he had theorized his way into believing were not real limits at all. Just thresholds. Just places where the untrained mind gave up before the body actually had to. He wrote about this directly, repeatedly, in his journals and his philosophical notes. The obstacle is the opportunity. The resistance is the training. The discomfort is where the growth happens. This is not wrong. In most contexts, for most purposes, this philosophy produced results that no other approach could have produced. But the body has limits that do not respond to philosophy. Sodium levels don't negotiate. The brain, inside a rigid skull, has nowhere to expand when fluid pressure rises. These are not mental thresholds to be pushed through. They are physical facts. And Bruce Lee, who had made a life's work of distinguishing between real limits and imagined ones, never fully developed the framework to know which category he was in. Brandon Lee was 8 years old when his father died. He grew up in his father's shadow the way children grow up in shadows, shaped by it, reaching toward the light beyond it, never quite escaping it. He studied martial arts. He became an actor. By the early 1990s, he was beginning to establish something of his own, not just the son of Bruce Lee but a presence in his own right, with a physical ease in front of the camera and a charisma that was genuinely his. The Crow was going to be the film that separated him from the shadow completely. On March 31, 1993, during a night shoot in Wilmington, North Carolina, Brandon Lee was hit by a bullet fragment that had become lodged inside a prop gun, a gun that was supposed to be loaded with blank cartridges, that had been checked, that had been cleared. He was 28 years old. He was taken to New Hanover Regional Medical Center, where surgeons worked for 6 hours. He died on April 1st. Linda Lee, who had become a widow at 28, buried her son at 28. Brandon was interred next to his father at Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, the same city where Bruce had first taught martial arts in parking lots and back alleys, where the philosophy had begun, where the framework had been built. The press reached immediately for the word curse. 2 Lees, 2 impossibly early deaths, a father and son taken by freak accidents decades apart. The narrative assembled itself almost automatically. But curses require mystery. And what happened to Brandon Lee was not mysterious at all. It was a catastrophic failure of safety protocol on a film set. A bullet tip had been lodged in the barrel of the prop gun during an earlier scene and had not been detected. When the blank cartridge fired, the tip was discharged with lethal force. An investigation. An inquest. Settlements. Changes to industry safety standards that came too late for Brandon Lee. Not a curse. A preventable accident. Which is, in some ways, harder to accept than a curse. A curse implies fate. A preventable accident implies that someone, somewhere, could have done something differently. The parallel between father and son is real, but it is not mystical. It is this: both Bruce Lee and Brandon Lee died from failures of systems designed to protect them. In Bruce's case, the system was his own body, and the failure was slow and accumulative and invisible until it was complete. In Brandon's case, the system was an external safety protocol, and the failure was sudden and visible and devastating. In neither case was the outcome inevitable. In both cases, the outcome was irreversible. Shannon Lee was 4 years old when her father died. She was 28 when she lost her brother. She did not disappear into grief, though she had every reason to. She built something. She took control of the Bruce Lee estate and spent the following decades making decisions about how her father's image, philosophy, and legacy would be managed. Decisions that were frequently contested, always complicated, and consistently driven by a commitment to representing the man as he actually was rather than as the mythology required him to be. In 2019, she produced Warrior, a television series based on a concept her father had developed and pitched to studios in the early 1970s, only to be passed over in favor of a white lead. The series was made, finally, nearly 50 years after Bruce first imagined it, with the Asian American cast and the specific cultural vision he had intended. Shannon Lee did not just preserve a legacy. She completed an argument. Her father had spent his life insisting that the stories told about Asian people, in Hollywood, in martial arts culture, in the Western imagination generally, were incomplete. That the image and the reality were not the same thing. That the gap between them was not incidental but structural, and that closing it required more than individual achievement. It required changing who got to tell the story. Shannon Lee changed who got to tell the story. 50 years of theories. 50 years of speculation, poison, conspiracy, revenge, supernatural retribution. The theories were always more satisfying than the truth because they gave Bruce Lee's death the scale and drama that seemed appropriate for a life that had the scale and drama of his. But the truth doesn't work that way. The truth is that Bruce Lee died of hyponatremia, a condition caused by drinking too much water, compounded by a surgical procedure that impaired his ability to cool his own body, compounded by training at an intensity that his body, in its compromised state, could no longer sustain. A medication that was completely ordinary in any other context tipped a system that was already at the edge. He had been warned. His body had sent the clearest possible signal 2 months before he died, and he had looked at that signal and decided it was behind him. This is not a story about weakness. Bruce Lee was not weak. The same qualities that made him extraordinary, the obsession, the refusal to accept limits, the absolute commitment to the logic of his own system, were the qualities that made him unable to receive the warning his body was sending. He was too sophisticated in some directions to be wise in this one. And here is what sits at the center of this, the thing that remains after all the theories have been cleared away. Bruce Lee's most famous philosophical statement was about water. Be water, he said. Be formless. Be shapeless. Adapt to the container you're given. Don't resist. Flow. It was the lesson he taught. It was the lesson he could not teach himself. Water, in the end, is what killed him. Not metaphorically, chemically, medically, literally. He had made water the symbol of the ultimate form of intelligence, the willingness to yield, to adapt, to find a path through rather than forcing a path against. And then he consumed it beyond what his body could process, and it swelled his brain until he died. There are people who will find in that a kind of cosmic irony. There are people who will find a lesson. There are people who will continue to prefer the theories, the poison, the conspiracy, the malevolent hand, because a meaningful death feels more appropriate than an accumulative failure of judgment. But the lesson, if there is one, is not about irony. It is about something more uncomfortable. Even the most disciplined mind, even the most sophisticated understanding of the body, even the most complete and rigorously tested philosophy of physical and mental mastery, none of it protects you from the parts of reality you've decided don't apply to you. Bruce Lee decided that certain rules didn't apply to him. He was right about almost all of them. He was wrong about the ones that mattered most. And in the space between those two things, one of the most extraordinary human beings of the 20th century ran out of time.